And hopefully we're all good. All right, let's kick it off. As you already know, I am John Hubbard, and let me give you a quick rundown on my background here. Worked in security operations centers my entire InfoSec career. I started as a SOC analyst, eventually became a SOC manager, seen it all, been through it all, and I'm passionate about bringing people into this industry. And one of the things I love talking about is what's going on in the news and what can we do in as simple of a way as possible that can actually disrupt some of these things that seem incredibly advanced. So, what we're going to be talking about in this presentation here is what some of the more concerning, I'll say, items that have been popping up in the news are, and then some of the moves we can take, at least as far as we can get in 30 minutes, to get rid of those and detect them and stop those kind of attacks from happening to us. Author of two classes that relate to this: Sec 450, Blue Team Fundamentals, and LDR 551, which is Building and Leading Security Operations Centers. All right, like to frame everything with some positivity. So I do want to say, before we get into what will sound scary, blue teams are winning. If you look at the numbers, at least from the Mandiant M Trends report, on how long it takes to detect attacks year after year, defenders have been improving in like very, very significant ways. If you look at the beginning of this orange arrow, 416 days has gone down, 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 all the way until all the data from last year showed 10 days is now the average. However, we are still potentially missing some concerning attacks, and we have some opportunities to catch those, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So, looking at the news recently and some of the things that are, I would say, scarier that are happening out there that are maybe a little bit harder to detect that I want to bring up in this session. Edge device compromise, operational technology compromise, basically compromise of any of our infrastructure, stuff that is not a specific laptop, desktop, server, things like that, right? Or non-traditional devices. That can be your switches, your routers, your firewalls, VPN concentrators, email gateways, stuff like that. Once they get in, and that is one of the best ways for them to get in and really stay resident in a very sneaky way, is living off the land, using the stuff that is already in the environment, already installed on the machine to achieve as much as they possibly can, which means there's nothing malware wise to detect. So we're going to be looking for the evidence of those sorts of things, which can be difficult to spot. And then on top of all of that, we have some new encryption protocols that are further blinding us. So let's dive right in here because I got a whole bunch of stuff to kind of freight train through here in 30 minutes. It was hard to select what slides I wanted to keep. All right, recent attacks that I have been watching, I've been reading the reports on, and I've been thinking about what we can do as a security community to start getting ahead of this as much as we can, right? This was one from earlier this year. China-backed Volt Typhoon hackers lurked inside U.S. critical infrastructure for at least 5 years. At least. Not good, right? Now, yes, this is a US-centric headline, as are a lot of the ones I'm going to show here. But of course, right, this is not particular to the US or this threat group. Anywhere, any threat actor, any country, right, this is a key capability for a lot of threat actors to have, is control of critical infrastructure inside a country in case some kind of conflict breaks out, right? So we saw this one. That was a pretty big deal. Just a couple weeks ago, September 18th, FBI recently dismantled the second major China-linked botnet. This is from a group called Flax Typhoon. The previous one was Volt Typhoon. All these are ending in Typhoon. This is Microsoft's threat actor naming structure. This was a botnet that was out that was being used to facilitate a lot of this illicit traffic, basically proxying traffic around to allow a lot of this stuff to happen. Was thinking, well, yep, another scenario there. And then a week later, another one, right? They talk about Salt Typhoon, which is a third group, all ultimately China Nexus threat actors, that was being caught inside internet service providers in the US. And if you think about it, and we're going to get into this, what can you do if you get inside an internet service provider? The implications of that are rather scary. So these are some of the things I'm like, all right, well, if this is what's going on and they're going to give us details, we better pay attention, right? Whether you're in critical infrastructure or not, this is the kind of thing. These are, effectively like some of the top tier attackers out there. They clearly have some intense goals for what they're trying to get at. And so if this is what they're doing, if you can stop the groups that are easier than this, you're in a great spot. However, clearly we have a problem. These things are working. So I want to take a look at the tactics and say, what are these groups doing that's actually finding success? And is it something the SOC can do something about? Yes. Short answer, it is. So Volt Typhoon, as a group, what is this group all about? Back when this was originally released in February, what they were talking about in the joint statement, which I have a short link to, by the way, if you go to sec450.com/volt, that'll take you to a report where a lot of this information, there's a lot of detail on some of the stuff I have in this presentation. They were talking about this is a group that is attributed to China and looking to pre-position capabilities to launch all sorts of different cyber attacks across a wide swath of critical infrastructure. Some of the things they listed here: aviation, rail, mass transit, highway, maritime, pipeline, water, and sewage plants. Not the kind of thing you want to hear next to the word cyber attack, right? To the point where the FBI director has called this the defining threat of our generation. You can agree or disagree with that, but that's a pretty dire warning, right? And that's just Volt Typhoon, which is one of the three threat groups that we're talking about here. How they're doing this and what they're trying to ultimately get towards here is a position where, even though they're not using those capabilities yet, they have a very sneaky set of ways of persisting in these networks. So in the future, if they do need to turn it on and use it, they are ready to hit the button and go. So one of the ways they're doing this is compromising routers, firewalls, VPNs, and all the stuff that we might not have great visibility for. We don't have great visibility for this stuff because a lot of times we are reliant on endpoint controls when it comes to like buying a router. You can't install your EDR agent on that. So what are we going to do about those things? Well, they know we have that problem. And so that's one of the ways they're able to not only get in a very sneaky way, but stay persistent. And even if you clear them off your endpoints, they're going to walk right back in because they're living in your firewall, which is not a comfy place to have attackers, right? And so once they got in, they were basically maintaining access and they were getting privilege through various lateral movement, privilege escalation techniques, credential access, all that kind of stuff, and then just sitting on it, right? Which is a bit ominous. You don't know exactly what they're planning, but you know where they have control, and it's not great. That's just Volt Typhoon. Salt Typhoon is the other one that was more recently announced a couple days ago. Really, there's been articles over the last couple of weeks about this group. This is a group that has been active since 2020. You may have heard of them under different names. Every threat group has different names. Salt Typhoon is the Microsoft threat actor name. There's APT 40, there's Famous Sparrow, there's Ghost Emperor. These are all supposedly the same threat actor. There's a little bit of art and science when it comes to threat actor naming that may or may not be perfect overlap, but that's what's out there. And what this is believed to be is China's Ministry of State Security focusing on ISP access and prepositioning specifically in internet service providers. And now here's where it gets scary, right? If you read these articles that came out a couple days ago, what they said, although this is all still under investigation and none of this has been like publicly confirmed or otherwise, what they basically said is it looks like they are trying to get into like your ISP's router so they can steer traffic on the internet, tap traffic on the ISP, and do even worse things like get into the national law enforcement facility for doing wiretaps. That's like the ultimate privilege escalation, right? If you can, we always talk about in 450, right? Like what happens if your attacker gets into your email, into your Slack conversations, attackers call in on conference bridge lines. This is like the phone line version of that, right? It's really hard to recover if someone is inside your infrastructure, reading your emails, or in this case, listening to your phone calls that may be classified information. Big problem here. And they called it a potentially catastrophic national security breach. And again, do not think this is only happening in the US, even though these are US headlines. I guarantee this is a capability that a lot of people want to have all across the globe. Let's talk some tactics here. Flax Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, what are they doing? How are they pulling this off? A lot of this stuff is not magic. They come up with some web-based exploitation. They may be able to throw those exploits at some of these network infrastructure devices and let themselves in. Now, sometimes, yes, that is a 0-day. We've seen a few of those. We've seen Avanti. We've seen Barracuda email security gateways. We've seen Fortinet problems recently. But there's always going to be another exploit, right? But just because they have the exploit doesn't mean everything else is going to work. Once they get into a lot of these servers, some of the things that are specifically listed in the article I have here on Flax Typhoon, they were using a piece of closed source malware called the China Chopper web shell. Web shells are something you absolutely should be able to detect. They were doing privilege escalation with Metasploit, Juicy Potato, Mimikatz, a lot of the stuff that we talk about in many different SANS classes. If you're not familiar with those terms, feel free to Google them. I don't have time to cover them in a 30-minute presentation. Wish I did. Moving around with lateral movement, just plain RDP, right? We can look at that and say, where's their RDP that we don't expect there to be RDP? And then once they connect to those machines, they're living off the land, which initially seems sneaky until you start looking at the things being typed, and maybe it's not as sneaky as they initially think. But a lot of people aren't watching or they don't know what to look for. Once they get into those ultimate systems they want to maintain access to, one of the things that was listed was they were using the soft ether VPN client to allow themselves to just immediately VPN right back into those systems. You should be able to see a VPN client being installed. You should be able to see the network traffic for VPN traffic going to a system that shouldn't have a VPN client specifically installed from a vendor that you've probably not used anywhere else in the environment, right? Once they got there, they were also renaming their malware to things that were innocuous looking: conhost, DLL host, VPN bridge, things like that to evade defense. Again, none of that, except for the initial step, maybe, is a 0-day. Those are all things that are visible with basic log collection. As long as you have an EDR, traditional log collection, a SIEM, there's a lot of ways of looking at that stuff. What about Volt Typhoon? Again, they were using the 0 days or publicly known exploits to get in, followed by VPN access and other things to let them back in. Once they got in, they were stealing credentials. They were, again, moving over RDP. They were using living off the land and PowerShell querying and other things to basically discover what was going on in the environment, collect information, and then use that to their advantage. And in this case, sit there and do nothing yet, although a lot of these groups have been kicked out. Pretty interesting stuff, right? And again, to know what's happening is one thing, to know how it's happening is another thing, and to know that we can actually potentially spot it is an encouraging thing, hopefully, to you. One of the things I thought was particularly interesting is they're trying to abide by good attacker OPSEC, as any attacker should. One of the things they were using were different botnets that they were crafting out of out of life Cisco or Netgear routers in one case for Volt Typhoon, KV botnet, huge takedown back in January, what was facilitating the traffic to do all of this exploitation, and the Flax Typhoon botnet, which was taken down a couple weeks ago. Regardless of the device being infected, what I want to point out here is that a lot of the traffic coming from these groups is going to an infected device, maybe on your own ISP in your country, and then the exploit's coming to you. So if you're looking at where your traffic is going, you might see traffic to someone's house, to another business, something nearby. It is not necessarily going to be traffic to a foreign country, which is fairly clever. However, some of the things that they were doing, and one of the tools that was specifically called out, was unique software that you should be able to detect to be able to do this. So they call out in the Volt Typhoon report that I had linked there, sec450/volt, the tool FRP, Fast Reverse Proxy. And the way that this tool works is you basically get a whole bunch of infected devices and they become this public pool of IP addresses. And you install a client on all the infected devices right here. And then the attacker can connect to any one of these FRP servers, and then that's going to allow them to connect to one of these clients, and then that's going to connect to your device surreptitiously through your firewall, ignoring all firewall rules and things like that. This is a capability. This is one way of doing it. I have seen this done in plenty of other ways, right? But FRP is its own tool. It's open source. It is not a secret. You can detect it. You can find it. You can look for the hash. If you see it, it's probably a bad sign. This is the same sort of capability, though, demonstrated when you see like Cloudflare tunnels or local expose or ngrok. It's ways that they can basically VPN in a lot of ways into your environment and ignore your firewall rules and just get directly to a service on a local system that may only be hosted on localhost. Some specific artifacts for FRP. None of this stuff is magic, right? They're using odd ports, port 7000, port 1080, 8443, non-standard ports, things that should be sticking out, although there's no guarantee it's bad when you see an odd port. It's a great place to start your investigation. Anomalies are important to look at. Some of the things that were called out specifically for Volt Typhoon, they were connecting out to domains that were meant to look like a legitimate domain. So they called out compromising the power company in Guam. So they used the domain pdsguam.biz. Now, if you think about some of the things that Mark Baggett was talking about, and I was kind of leading on at the end of that discussion, if you are parsing out your DNS logs, you can look for weird domain names that no one's ever connected to before. Once you see that list, and you see that list contains something that looks like but is not the real power company domain name, you should be able to catch that, right? We're looking for anomalies in our DNS. We're looking for anomalies in IP addresses, port numbers, binaries that are creating network traffic. Again, even if you don't know the tool, just knowing that something unique is happening might be enough to lead you in a lot of cases to where the weird thing is. They're renaming the files again, right? Bright Metric Agent, SMC, or SM Service, SMC SVC service.exe. A little bit confusing one there, but if you see something that is a unique binary, unique file name, stuff like that, and then on top of this, it was UPX packed, which is, if you're not familiar with malware packing, the weakest way of doing malware packing that you can just immediately undo as a defender. You can catch this stuff, right? You can undo this, you can catch this. This is not the ultimate in stealth, but this was a very advanced APT. They only had to raise the bar that high to get through, so that's all they did. But you can catch this. So what are we going to do about this? Some of the things for these specific items, think about your threat model. Before anything technical happens, you have to think about, what do I have of value? What am I defending? What am I going to need to do to defend that specific thing? Keith talked about it earlier, the CIA triad. Specifically, what aspects are you worried about? How are attackers going to get in there? And then what is that specifically going to look like? Some of the things related to this section, network security monitoring is going to come back. EDR is great. I love EDR. It's maybe the best tool that we have that have come out in recent years, but it doesn't cover everything. And so if your firewall is compromised, what else can you do other than look for unique traffic that it has never produced before? And if it's the source of something that looks like, I don't know, FRP traffic, then maybe you got a problem, right? Application control on top of all of this. These are off-the-shelf executables, and it doesn't even matter if they are or they aren't. They're an executable that wouldn't be on the list of approved programs. We have these basic controls. You can run them in block mode. You can run them in audit mode. I don't even care if you never get to block mode. Audit mode is enough to help you see, hey, there's an executable running. No one's run this before. It's not on the list. What is it? And then you start pulling apart threads, catch the attacker. Beyond that, living off the land. This is another one. So living off the land can be done in just so many ways. So what I'm going to talk about here is just 4 quick things that were mentioned specifically as they were done, like literally exactly what was typed by the attackers, and give you some kind of general advice on what we can do to catch this stuff. So one thing that is a little bit deeper down in the weeds, right? We know about PowerShell. That's going to come up in a second as well. WMIC or WMIC, depending on how you like to pronounce it. It's the Windows Management Instrumentation Command Line utility, and it gives you access to query basically anything in a Windows system. And most people don't know it's there. Most defenders don't understand it, and attackers love it for those reasons. So some of the things attackers can do with this is enumerate what's on the system, start processes, move laterally, do all sorts of fun stuff. So in that report that I quoted here, one of the things that they noticed that these groups were doing to live off the land was heavily using WMIC to do things like gather the disk information, look at who's logged in on the system in the past, start malware processes and things like that. Now, how do we catch this? We can look for direct command line invocation of this, and we can also use WMI event tracing, which something is you may or may not have turned on. It's not always turned on by default, and it can be a high volume log source. But these are certainly things that are visible. They don't take expensive tooling to necessarily collect, but some of it can be high volume log sources and things you need to filter. So that is a concern, but I want to kind of bring it up and throw it out into the ether. If you haven't heard about it before, one to research, no time to dive into it now. Another thing, attackers love credentials. Attackers love single credentials. They love admin credentials, but even better than an admin credential is all of the credentials, admin and otherwise. Where would you get that? You would get that from a domain controller, and a domain controller keeps all of your password hashes in a file called the ntds.dit file, which is encrypted with a key that is stored in the system hive. Now, the thing is even if an attacker gets into your domain controller, which is full on a disaster, there is still a mechanism that's supposed to protect this. You can't just take a copy of it. It's a locked file. So they have to use certain specific commands to make a copy of it generally and take the copy. So NTDS util is one of the tools that can do that for you. And they were using WMIC to call this tool. And these are actually 3 quoted exactly what was typed by Volt Typhoon commands that was able to make a copy of the NTDS dit file. So these are, again, things that you can look at in the report, sec450.com/volt if you want to dive into this. But, somewhat confusing looking commands. If you haven't seen this before, you might not realize what's going on. What's going on is a complete compromise of your domain controller. So if you see this kind of thing, it's a huge problem. One thing I want to inject here, it's not about the tools. NTDS.dit, NTDS util is one way of getting something done that a lot of other tools can do as well. If we're talking about just copying that database, there are a bunch of other tools out there. So yes, it is important you know about individual tools, but even more important is knowing, oh, you can dump the ntds.dit database. This is what happens when you do that. Let me Google all of the tradecraft that attackers use to try to figure that out and make sure we catch every single one of those things. So secret dump from Impacket, Invoke, Ninja Copy, DS internals, FG dump, those sort of things are all the kind of tools that if you see them, the alarm bell should start ringing very, very loudly, right? Some of the other commands you can use with this, VSS admin is another one, creating shadow copies of NTDS-DIT. That's an oldie but goodie. That's been around for a long time as well. So you got to be aware of these things, got to watch for them, stay on top of them. They're built in and they're very, very dangerous. Other things, NetSH. Lateral movement is something nearly every attacker has to do. They're not going to land on the first machine that has all the details they want immediately when they get into an environment. So I want to point out here, NetSH is another built-in command in the Windows firewall with a function called port proxy. And if you turn this on with the commands that, again, are quoted directly from the attacker right here, you can take input on one port on an IP address, generally be listen on all interfaces. That's what all the zeros are, and then send it right back out to another IP address on another destination port. This would be potentially especially useful if you have a bastion host where there's a protected subnet on one side and then the rest of the corporate network on the other side. You don't need to use like Meterpreter or anything like that to relay traffic from one to the other. You can use stuff that is built into Windows to do this. So if you see a command like that, big problem. The other one, PowerShell. Don't need to stay too long on this one. I will say PowerShell is an attacker favorite. We all probably know that. Logging it can be sort of painful. What I want to call out here is that attackers love to use PowerShell because you are potentially not logging it. Some of the things they were doing, looking at who is logged in or who has been logging in on a given system. That's what that first command is there. Get event log security instance ID 4624. That is looking for successful login events in Windows. And the next one is starting up hidden processes. So that's running a batch script and then making sure the window stays hidden from the user when they run that. Collection and exfiltration. Plenty of other things can be done here as well. You can dump Active Directory objects. There's a tool built into anything with the ADDS role installed, LDI FDE, that's going to basically take all of the items in Active Directory, dump them into a big list, copy them out so they know what users and groups exist. And then from there, regardless if it's that being stolen or anything else, this is something I've definitely personally seen as well. Making copies of that file, putting it in some place that looks like something that's totally innocuous, and then zipping and compressing that with a password encrypted zip file, or 7-zip and WinRAR were these two specific examples here. If you see commands like this, watch out. I have seen this before, and if you don't capture that command line, you will not know what is stolen because all you're going to be left with is an encrypted archive, and they're going to be exfilling it as the next step. So those are some other things you want to watch out for. Again, more in the report. What can we do about this? We need to study living off the land attacker tradecraft. Some reference pages on this. There are two that you can Google. Lolbass project. If you just Google Lolbass, you find it. The other one is GTFO bins, which is the Linux version. Both of these are websites that just have enormous lists of a whole bunch of commands that can be used to do unexpected things. It can be downloading files, it can be privilege escalation, all sorts of stuff like that. And so the way you would use this is you're looking through your SIEM, you're looking through command lines in your EDR, and you say, wait a minute, that's a weird invocation of that. I've never seen that before. But how could an attacker use it? Reference those pages. Great source for that sort of thing. Threat intelligence, just stay up to date. Government alerts on these specific groups that are coming out wherever you live. Typically, there's a lot of really good information coming out of, in our case here in the US, the NSA. Closed and open source vendor threat intelligence blogs. And then, of course, practice this. Have your red team try to do as much as they can living off the land and see if you catch any of it. Run a purple team exercise where the entire campaign is only doing living off the land tactics and try to exhaustively check all this stuff. All very, very important things to consider when it comes to some of these attack techniques that you will almost certainly see. Finally, modern network protocols. Some of these I'm going to go through quickly because I know Andy's about to talk to one of them. Quick is an important one. Quick is a newer protocol. If you're not familiar with it, look for UDP port 443. It's a protocol that encapsulates other protocols. The one that it's most commonly used for right now is HTTP 3. You are probably using it already. It's built into browsers. It a lot of times is used from Chrome to Google services. You can pull up the developer tab and see if you see H3 in the protocol column. And if you see that, you are using HTTP 3 right now. It supports other things, though. Andy's about to talk to him. DNS, it supports SMB, and a lot of other things. Here's the thing about Quick. Quick is new enough and complex enough that it's not super well dissected by a lot of tools out there. And you won't even get a chance to dissect it if you don't do TLS inspection. So we have to move towards TLS inspection. I'm going to say that a couple times here in this section. And then once you can take off the encryption, you still need a tool that can make sense of it. And only the newer versions of Wireshark can actually do that. Otherwise, you're going to get a little bit of a jumbled mess and it's not as easy to read. So make sure you have a new version of Wireshark for Quick for this protocol and HTTP 3 specifically. The solution here, at least in the middle kind of term of this, until we have tools that can fully support this, is block it. A lot of organizations fully block Quick. Look for UDP port 443 because there are post-exploitation tools that support using it. DOH, this is the one I'm going to go very quickly through because Andy's going to give us a deep dive in the next presentation, I think. It's DNS over HTTPS. You take DNS, you wrap it in HTTP2, you wrap that in TLS, and then you send it out the door. Defenders need to control DNS. If you can't control DNS, it is really hard to control your environment. And so again, without TLS decryption, you are not going to even see that that is DNS traffic. Your DNS firewall is not going to work. Malware is going to come with its own DNS settings. It's going to look like encrypted web traffic. If you're not using TLS inspection, good luck even realizing that this is happening. You're not logging the DNS. You are not stopping the DNS. You have no idea what's going on there. It's a completely opaque tunnel of TLS traffic going to an IP address, and you're not going to be able to do anything about that. So what can we do about this? The core answer here is TLS inspection and blocking all DOH going to anything that is not a company-approved DNS resolver. More on that in the next presentation. TLS 1.3. This one is important because it is by far and away, I think the majority of traffic at this point is quickly becoming like all of TLS traffic. TLS 1.2 is going away pretty quickly. And with this, you can no longer see certificate details. You still see the domain name, but it's harder to decrypt and you get less details if you aren't decrypting. And on top of that, there's a newer standard called ECH that is going to come eventually, although it's not supported yet, that is going to take even the domain name field away and hide the SNI field where we're currently able to pull the domain, leaving you only with the ability to see what IP address someone is connecting to. And that's going to be a really hard position to defend from, especially when the entire internet is Cloudflare fronted. So again, move to TLS decryption if you have not done it. I understand that's not an easy thing to just, oh, okay, I'll go do that. But you have to really, really push hard on this. The other two, HTTP 2 and HTTP 3. Just want to call these out. If you haven't seen decrypted HTTP 2, your homework today is to go find a packet capture of HTTP 2 and take it apart. The headers are different. You can't just right click and follow session and read them anymore. They are in binary format. Wireshark has to interpret them for you. And everything is broken into frames and streams. So if you've been a SOC analyst for a while and you're very comfortable with HTTP 1, following things, carving out files with the automatic, dump objects in Wireshark, none of that's going to work in HTTP 2. You got to do things more manually. It's not hard, but it's different. And the same is true of HTTP 3. This is another one that specifically you need Wireshark 4.2 and above to be able to fully and easily read. That came out in last November. Some Linux distros do not support it and do not have it in their repos, so make sure you are using 4.2 if you're trying to dissect and understand 4.3, or sorry, HTTP 3. Again, this is another very different thing. It's not necessarily difficult, but it is different. And you need to have the workflows to be able to carve files, follow sessions, understand what's going on, and read headers. And we're going to be more dependent on our tools for doing that. So for this, what are we going to do about that? TLS decryption is becoming basically completely necessary. If we're going to do real serious network defense, you are going to need to have as complete as possible TLS decryption as you can possibly get. Look for DOH, block it. Look for Quick, block it unless you know you want it or need it for some reason. And then make sure you as an analyst are practicing with HTTP 2 and HTTP 3. Following sessions, reading headers, carving files. Those are some of the 3 core things that any SOC analyst needs to be able to do. So that brings me to my closing set of slides here. The plan for cyber victory. I want to point out these are not impossible to spot tactics. I've only said 0-day and custom exploits a couple times, and everything else across the entire kill chain is something you already have or could have the logs for. So we can either prevent a lot of this or spot a lot of this as long as we are doubling down on our fundamentals and know what we're looking for, which you can get from threat intelligence reports. So, number one, prevent phishing resistant MFA. There's going to be a Blueprint podcast episode that comes out. I think it's going to be the next episode I release where I talk with two of the people from Microsoft on how they have fully rolled Microsoft into phishing resistant credentials. If Microsoft can do it, you can do it. Do not let people get your credential material. We have biometrics authentication, we got FIDO keys, we got everything, we got pass keys. The technology is here. Push the appropriate people in your organization to go in this direction as much as you can. And if you want details on that, from the actual source, pay attention to the podcast when it comes out in a week or two, probably when I get that episode out. Design networks like attackers are watching because they are. They're inside, they know your architecture. So if you're reliant on secrecy to defend your network, bad assumption, right? Assume they're in there and assume you have to be safe by architecture. Everything that was just said by Ismail and Andy, right? Zero trust, all of those things. As far as you can go in that direction, go in that direction and make things more defensible from the start, slow them down. Then we have to very, very closely monitor our endpoints and our devices. Endpoints specifically with EDR, it's great, roll that out where you can, but understand EDR can fail and understand your devices are not going to run EDR. So what are we going to do about that sort of thing? The first thing I want to point out here, EDR can fail you. A lot of people are like, what? You can kill EDR. It's a process like any other process. Attackers get in, they become admin or system level, they kill it, they turn it off. You become blind. What's going to happen then? You're going to say, well, it's going to tell me that, right? Maybe, sometimes, not always. There are ways, Google it, right? EDR has been killed over and over, malvert, AU kill. There's all sorts of tools out there to kill EDR, right? So we need some other kind of capability, some outside perspective to be able to catch this when our EDR fails us, although we rely on EDR data when we can. That's why I said network security monitoring, I think, is going to come back. It is the all-encompassing outside observer that hopefully we can rely on. I have a quote here from Rob Joyce. He was the director of the NSA TAO group at the time, and he basically said, my worst nightmare is a network tap. I can't get out of that. The data is going to be in your network data. So if you have the capability to record what's going on the network, even if your firewall is completely compromised, even if your domain controller or your other device has had the EDR killed, you should be able to see those things. AI. We have AI. AI can process massive amounts of data. One of the problems when it comes to security operations is what is normal? If you take some of the tactics from Dave's classes and some of the demos and things that he showed, you can feed it a ton of data and then say, here, learn what things normally look like, and then help me find when something odd is happening. That's the Splunk model-assisted threat hunting thing I was talking about before, and that's tactics and learning Python and everything else to be able to do this. And now we have Gen AI and LLMs and everything else to make it even easier to deal with these sort of things. So as much as you can, leverage AI to help you understand what normal is, which was formerly very, very difficult to do. And then finally, please double down on critical infrastructure protection. If this is a industry that you work in, read all the reports you can, understand that this is happening, and look very, very closely at your network traffic, your devices, and apply all the principles in this, because this is the way we keep the world safe, and our life and safety and keeping things normal depends on it and depends on you to be able to do this. So we're rooting for you.